girl, this little 6-year-old, had gone to school, come to a new community, didn't know anybody, was trying to settle in, not doing terribly well about it either. She wasn't making friends, partly because she wasn't she wasn't disruptive in the classroom. She wasn't making any noise. She was just a calm, quiet little thing. She wasn't academically gifted, so she wasn't standing out. I mean, this was like hands. So what she does is, I'm not sure how it is down here, but in some of our school systems where I come from, they have where sometimes they'll split the school. Some of the kids have to stay at the school over lunch hour, and some can actually walk home if they're relatively close. And this was one of those schools that had both. So what this little girl did was, even though she was supposed to stay at the school, she figured out around about October that she was fed up with this, and what she did was she began to leave the school campus, like the school playground, at lunch hour with the walk-home kids. And what she would do, though, is go across the street to a 7-Eleven store and go into the 7-Eleven store and get one of those little brown paper bags, and there would be, we have these bins of candy. I don't know if you have the same system, but so she would go in and she would begin to pick out, the gummy bears and the Tootsie Rolls and everything else, and she'd fill up a little brown paper bag. Now, she's 6 years old, right? So she has no money or anything, right? So what she figured out was if she stood in line at the checkout between two adults, right? Because if I'm an adult and I look back and I see a 6-year-old, I'm assuming, well, she's yours, Linda. And if Linda's standing here and she sees the 6-year-old, she's assuming she's mine. So this little 6-year-old has a little bag of candy, and she just kind of walks out of the store, right? Goes back to the playground and begins to hand out the candy to all the other kids, and suddenly she is popular. This goes on, if you can believe it, this goes on for 2 weeks. And she was able to pull this off for quite a while until somebody finally noticed, one of the vice principals of the school went, the kids are always chewing over there. What is going on with this, right? So they realize what she's up to, they figure it out, they call mom, and mom goes ballistic. I mean, for her, it's like, it's a direct, it's stealing gummy bears today, it's crack cocaine tomorrow, and then it's prostitute. I mean, there was no doubt in her mind where this gummy bears, it was going. She knew where it was going. So she pushes this kid in front of me. I look at this kid, and I figure I don't have to lecture her about not stealing candy. I just turn to her and I say, Ginny, what happens when you steal the candy? And in a small little voice, Ginny says, I have friends. I thought, for gosh sakes, surely we as an adult community, we can help this little kid have friends. Now, I don't know about you, but you can't force a kid to be friends with another kid. That never works out very well in my books. But you can make someone more socially desirable. You can focus on things that attract people to you, right? So what we did was we worked between the mental health team and the mom and the school. We coordinated a very small little intervention. Now, I know this is relatively simple, but what we did was we had Ginny. Basically, we arranged in this school, there was a junior kindergarten. I'm not sure if you have those here, but we had these would be 4-year-olds sort of part-time in the school system in the same building. And what would happen is that there was a teacher in the JK, and she would come up to the grade 1 classroom, knock on the door, we only had to do this like 3 or 4 times. And she would knock on the door of the grade 1 classroom and say, excuse me, and then teacher's name or whatever, Mrs. Smith or whatever, excuse me, we're a little short-staffed in the JK. I'm trying to teach. It's kind of a bit chaotic down there today. We don't have enough staff down there. I'm wondering if I could have Ginny come and help me teach. Now, I want you to imagine John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, just for a minute. Some of you are actually old enough to remember that image, right? And John Travolta, you know, that white suit and sort of walking down the street as if he's the center of the universe, the way Travolta sort of embodies I am it kind of thing, and I'm sure there's other people. And if you can imagine Ginny standing up in that classroom, looking around at her peers and going, excuse me, I've got to go teach. I'm going to go teach now. Now, what it did was it pivoted the energy around her, right? Suddenly she was somebody worth getting to know. And what it did was it created a cascade effect of more positive interactions, higher status, and access to something meaningful, contribution in the school. And it basically triggered a whole bunch of things that I'm going to talk about for the rest of the day that are scientifically quite astounding that we were able to put in place. Now, to be fair, I've had some pushback on this intervention. One of the pushbacks was from somebody who said to me, Mike, you just rewarded bad behavior. To which I kind of respond, who gives a crap, right? You know, like Do you really think that a little 6-year-old figures out that if I steal candy and break every other rule, that I'm going to get this permission to go and teach the little grade, the JKs? Like, who cares if you reward bad behavior? The point is that this kid needed that kind of resource in that particular context. And by giving it to her, she pivoted. We, in a sense, gave her an environment rich in new opportunities, and she changed her behavior. Now, the other comment I get sometimes from parents is, and this is always floors me, they say, well, if it's good for Ginny, then it should be good for my child too. And my child, these are those kinds of obsessive compulsive parents that, well, I'm up in Canada, so we have a lot of hockey parents. I'm sure you have some equivalent here, right? So they time every second their child is on the ice rink. Like, okay, my child plays 6 seconds less than every other child today. And they rail on the coach and all that, those kinds of crazy parents. Hope there are none in this room. Those are the kind of parents that say, well, if it's good for Ginny, it has to be good for my kid. To which we respond, oh, for gosh sakes, go get a life, right? Forget it. Your child has you. Every time your child does anything, they have a cheering section, right? They go to they play some sport, some basketball. Every time they dribble the ball, it's like, whoa, look at that! That's an amazing 5-year-old. It's all such a your kid does not need more egotistical self-improvement stuff, right? Ginny did. To my knowledge, she never stole another piece of candy. She settled in, and after that was sort of stabilized, we began to work on her relationship as well with her mom. Now, the reason I'm sort of telling you that is because I think that what we need to do, what I'd like to do in this first part this morning, with your permission, I just want to sort of give you some ideas about what resilience is and maybe what it isn't. One of the most common definitions of that term resilience is this kind of notion that, our capacity to overcome adversity. Don't write that down. That really is an awful definition. It really sucks. Completely sucks. Because if I told you that resilience is our capacity to overcome our adversity, then why do we have agape? I'm sorry, we don't need you. Right? We don't need any of you in the room. Because it's all about just my individual capacity to overcome my individual problems, and therefore it's all about my grit, and all I have to do is watch a few episodes of Oprah, or Dr. Phil, or whoever, and suddenly I'll be just fine without any social services. And actually, that is a myth. All the science in this field actually says that individual change accounts for relatively small amounts of what actually creates health and well-being long-term when you're under stress. So I'd rather sort of build a case here about resilience. Well, let me anchor you a little bit in some of where I'm coming at this from. First of all, I'm assuming adverse childhood experiences are a big deal in Memphis, right? I met Dr. Alpha Stewart the other day when I was here. I understand that this is a really big push here. Okay, let me walk you through. You know then, I don't even have to review these. You know these 10, I'm assuming everyone knows these, like I can make sure, that if you have if you have more of these 10 bad things happen to you before your 18th birthday, the science is really clear that you will have higher rates of all kinds of trauma-related diseases in adulthood, from heart disease to diabetes to depression, higher risk for addictions, more likelihood of being a victim of intimate partner violence, etc., etc. Okay, so those are the 10 high-risk things that you want to avoid kids having experiences of. Now, what's interesting is you often get these bar charts, right? You may have seen stuff like this. Okay, so, as you get more and more of these bad things happening to you, according to Robert Anda and his team, you end up having a higher likelihood of depression in adulthood. Okay, this is kind of boring and same old, right? But here's the really interesting thing. Did you ever think about it, the fact that 51% of people who have all these risk factors in their lives still do not develop depression? So I was actually talking to Robert Anda, who's one of the architects of this whole ACEs thing. He was one of the guys that did one of the first big studies at the Kaiser Permanente and with all the 10,000 people and adults and all that kind of stuff. And I was talking to Robert, and I said, Robert, how do you explain that 51% of people still do not develop the depression as per you would predict? And he said, rather profoundly, we don't know. We never thought to look. They did not look. They did not investigate why people did not develop those problems. So that is what I look at. Essentially, the science of resilience sort of says, okay, you got these things happening in your world. What other things might happen? Now, this is not my list. I'm going to give you some ideas of what my list is. But people are beginning to also talk about benevolent childhood experiences and their interaction. And this is a list that's just being published in a journal called Child Abuse and Neglect. I'm one of the guest editors of this. And this team kind of began to hypothesize a group of other things that might be useful for kids. If you felt safe with a caregiver, if you had a good friend, if you have beliefs that gave you comfort, if you liked your school, if there was a teacher who cared about you, if you had good neighbors, if there was another adult who gave you some support, or you had opportunities for good times, you were comfortable with yourself, or indeed you had maybe some home routines. And what we're beginning to understand is, whether it's that list or another list which I'm going to present, what we're understanding is that we can undo the ACEs. You know, the other profound thing about the ACEs is they're all completely preventable, right? They're all responsive to social policy shift. They have nothing to do with individuals. You do get that, right? There's nothing that, none of the ACE are really pivot on what individuals do. They are all about good interventions from organization, or how you organize your communities. We could drop most people off of a caregiver who was incarcerated just by changing the way the courts sentence people related to, say, drug crimes or other things like that. It's absolutely ridiculous that in one generation, 10 years, we could tackle heart disease, or diabetes, and depression in the adult population coming up through the one generation. These are really quite easy things to conquer because we know the science behind actually what prevents these things. So now, the problem, however, is that we're still stuck in a bit of a mindset about what resilience is. And some of you may have tripped across Jon Kabat-Zinn's work. He's the guy who's been putting taking those Buddhist monks out of their little hovels in the mountains of Tibet and shoving them into fMRI machines and scanning their brains and looking at neuroplasticity and all this kind of stuff, and proving that if you meditate, you can actually improve your capacity to function and self-regulation skills. This is a really good field. I'm not entirely distancing myself from it. But there's a little bit of a naivety in these studies, right? I heard Kabat-Zinn recently speak in Washington, and he said, you know, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. It's beautiful, right? It's very Oprah-esque. I like Oprah, by the way. It's a very, very empowering. It's very much about you. It's a great thought, right? The problem with it is that it's a lot easier to learn to surf if you also have a surfboard, a coach, and a lifeguard. And for some reason, these motivational speakers who are running around the world talking about it's all about you and grit and mindfulness and everything else, they seem to forget that a lot of people don't even have a surfboard, a coach, or a lifeguard to begin with. So it's a little hard to do the meditation. And the way I know that is because have anyone been to Nepal or Tibet? Anybody? Out of curiosity? If you go there, what you see, and if you've had this experience, is those Buddhist monks sitting up in their little echelons, they don't do it on their own. There's a whole community out in the community having the babies, plowing the fields, cutting the rice, harvesting the rice, grinding it, making it into some sort of food, and hauling it up to those lazy monks can sit in their hovels meditating all day. Right? And we kind of forget that somewhere in that mix is actually a story of resilience as embedded in our communities and our institutions and the supports. Now, I'm not dissing, by the way. The people who do that for the Buddhist monks honestly find contentment and self-actualization by the service they give to their spiritual leaders. Don't get me wrong, that's cool. But let's be real clear. Those Buddhist monks are not up there reprogramming their brains on their own. And that is the story that I want to tell you about resilience, because I don't work with privileged people. I work with people globally who are really struggling under post-colonial societies, places that are in disaster and large humanitarian crises and stuff. And you begin to sort of see in those contexts, as well as in my own country, in places like kids in jails and abusive families and everything else, and you begin to see that we have a profound impact on outcomes. If I could even show you a little bit of a twist on this, because you work with kids, not Buddhist monks, I'm assuming. this is some data about 5,000 kids out of West Coast Canada. And what it shows is, look, if you have kids that have physical and sexual victimization, or both, would you agree that their likelihood of thinking suicidal thoughts is elevated? Is that pretty, you're pretty good on this? There's no debate on that science, right? But here's the interesting thing. In this particular study, they also asked, how connected are you at school? Let me ask, any of you have children yourself, school-aged kids? Anybody have, or have raised school-aged kids? You got some? When your kids get to school, I'm just really serious about this, does anybody greet them by name as they enter the school campus? Does anybody have that experience in Memphis? Yeah, that's very cool. And what I'm arguing is, from this kind of research, is that if your kid arrives at school and somebody actually says, hi, Johnny, whatever, welcome here today, you know, and that they notice, your lunch, you seem to not, you look a little frayed, you look very tired. Like, just that small contact engages the kid and makes them feel like they belong someplace. And what we're actually seeing is that the higher a kid reports more school connectedness, the more that school matters to them. This has nothing to do with grades, by the way. Nothing at all about marks. This has to do with, do you feel like you belong at your school? And kids who report that, their rates of suicidal ideation drop dramatically, even though they've had histories of abuse. And for me, what that teaches me is that the very first, if I meet a kid in a school environment, or I meet a kid in your community, and they say, I've been physically and sexually abused, I do not send them to the psychologist. Not at first. The first thing I do is I talk to the school and say, is anybody noticing this kid? Did anybody notice that they didn't show up yesterday? Is anybody checking in on them? And if we can get that in place, the science says about 70% of kids will respond to that kind of intervention. And then there will be, by the way, I'm not if there's any psychologists in the room, I didn't just unemploy you, okay? Honestly, you still have a job. Because at the very end of this, there is still a tail. There's still going to be a bunch of kids that need tertiary level services. So that is much more the dynamic that I'm sort of coming at this from. Now, if I haven't sort of lost you yet, I want to sort of start. I want to give us some solid ground on what this idea is, because there's a fair bit in it, right? I mean, we're very good. I'm always amazed if I asked you to assess anxiety, or I give you a kid with a certain behavioral problem, like they're acting out in school or something. We got lovely scripts, but when it comes to resilience or designing community services and stuff, it's like we're totally random. Oh, well, maybe they need to attend a spiritual community, or maybe I should talk to their teacher, or maybe I should do this, or maybe I should get them involved in basketball. I mean, it's like taking a box of M&Ms and just scattering them around, and some kids get the purple ones, and some kids get the blue ones. But there's actually a little bit more cohesiveness to the ideas, and that's, I think, what I'd like to share with you today. So, if I could, the first thing, if you want to understand resilience, you're going to have to understand the risks that people are exposed to. I'm not a positive psychologist. I don't think about general population variables. I think about, when you're in a tough situation, what is it that's most likely to have the biggest impact? And so the first thing you have to understand is what's the risk exposure. And so we talk about severity and chronicity, because we know, just think about some of the people you've worked with who have been sexually abused. I'm assuming that's common enough. It's common enough in my community, and perhaps it's common enough in your community. And if you're thinking about that, then you're beginning to think about what was the severity and what was the chronicity of those episodes. And different people will experience sexual abuse from different kinds of sexual abuse at different pacing. And it will impact people in very different ways. I'm sorry if I'm triggering people, but I'm going to do that a lot today, because we're going to talk about some really tough issues, right? So this is going to, I apologize up front, but just to sort of prep yourself that we're going to, I'm going to be talking about some of these issues along the way. So, things like severity, things like chronicity, also things like ecological level. I mean, that's just a fancy idea for, if you think about it, right? If you have a learning challenge, and you live in a great little neighborhood with a great little family, and your school is well funded because of the tax base or whatever, right? And you have a learning challenge, who cares? I care, I'm empathetic. But it's a minor glitch in your life. You will continue. You can get onto college, you can get onto university, you can become really anything you want, because if all the supports and stuff are there and you're well resourced, then you're going to make it. But imagine you're the same person. So, imagine I just, you ma'am, you have a learning challenge, and you know, that's your mom, and very, very nice mom, and she watches and she does the extra reading, and that's your tutor, and that's your dad, and that's your school, and everything's good. And then I kind of pick, yourself, you have the same learning challenge. But your mom is really, really struggling with some trauma, some past problems. And your school is really badly underfunded. And there's all kinds of other triggers and violence and everything else, right? And you don't have all those other supports. Same learning challenge, same diagnosis, completely different pathways and outcomes. And we forget that you're not more resilient because you get somewhere. You're actually possibly less resilient than her because you're coping with a higher, what's called allostatic load, or you're dealing with a higher load on you in terms of disadvantage. So we have to think about that. We should also think about, do you attribute your problems to yourself or to others? Let's face it, if you've been in a family where nobody has gone past grade 6 or grade 8, then you might attribute your learning challenge to, that ain't a learning challenge, that's just the way things are. That's just who we are. Versus a family where, if you're in a family that's, everyone's gone to college, your learning challenge might be incredibly burdensome on you. And of course, your cultural and contextual relevance of the risks you face. Different risk factors look very different in different contexts and different cultures, right? It's not all the same thing. And I'm always amazed when people they just tick boxes. The one that you always see, especially in the American literature. You got the number of studies that have come out of the US on single parents. If I was even more explicit, single African American parents, women, let's be really specific, right? Disadvantage. You get every hyperbole, every little statement in front of that, every adjective that says disadvantage. And that is such, not to mention it's totally disgusting science, but it's also disgusting in terms of that we overlook that we just don't talk enough about the potential strengths. We make the blind assumption that those descriptors mean something. And what we understand is that you have to ask more broad questions about the ecological context in which that is occurring. Which is better? Being a sole parent, notice I switched from single to sole. Sole parent, meaning which is better? To be a sole parent living with your kids in a nicely networked community with your grandparents nearby, etc., or living in an abusive, isolated relationship with your spouse on an army base half a world away or something. And my argument was, obviously, the latter is a safer, more healthy space. But all we do is the census data, people come up and they look at you and they tick, single parent, disadvantage, problem. Whereas they didn't ask the next question. The next question I should ask you is, if tonight there was a problem at midnight, and you had to have your child looked after while you had to run to the hospital or something, how many yards, I was going to say meters, how many yards is the nearest support person to come over and look after your child? Right? That is a measure of resilience. That is a measure of how strong your community actually is, and tells me whether or not you're at risk at all. But we don't think like that often, right? We just kind of blindly sort of tell people who they are. Now, what's interesting about resilience, if you're working with me on this, is at lower levels of risk exposure, you can talk about changing personality, you can talk about changing cognition, self-regulation, helping people to flip the switch, right? You can get people to sort of think new thoughts. So you can imagine a situation, right, where at lower levels of risk, it's about the individual to change. I have no problem with that. That's a really powerful idea. But as risk exposure increases, then you're going to have to start thinking also about what resources are available, are they accessible, right? There might be an educational system, but if you're at home helping your mom who has a severe depression or something, then it's not really like you can go to school every day. You're going to be talking about strategic use of resources. The little girl who stole the candy, I'm going to argue she strategically made use of whatever was at hand to sort of figure her life out. And of course, what kind of reinforcement do we get for the strategies that we use that make it possible for us to survive and thrive? And of course, does our environment itself have the capacity to change? Can your community give you back what you need when you're actually in a crisis? And to the extent that it does, I'm going to argue we're much more likely to actually do well. So I'm suddenly talking about resilience in a much more systemic, ecological way that, if I could, gives you back your jobs. Because suddenly you become really important, right? And this is actually what we're finding. And we know it because of the science. Now, I always like, I mean, I'm a scientist, right? So I'm supposed to talk about science here. So let's do some science. Have you ever really thought about the story of Cinderella? Like, it's an interesting story, but it's kind of like told completely wrong. Well, first of all, that is not going to work well for me. If I could, first thing, I want to, this is the Disneyfied version of the Grimm's Brother tale. I mean, I need to apologize. So this is Disney's version of it. So first of all, the image of Cinderella is, of course, incredibly sexist, right? She's always portrayed in a particular Barbie doll-like way and everything else. And of course, I'm going to deconstruct even here the bias in the skin color. This kid, she's pasty white. There's a sort of an incredible racial bias in how she is portrayed and everything else. It's actually not necessarily in the original stories. With those caveats, if you can cut me some slack on this for a second, what I'm going to argue is that the story is mistold because, well, it's always told about her. Her mother dies, and then she's raised for a bit, and then her father dies, and she's left with the quote-unquote evil stepmothers, but she's so good of heart, and she has all those friends who are the little birds and the mice and everything else, and then somehow she magically ends up in the palace, right, and she has the right foot size for the glass slipper, and it all goes really well, and then suddenly she gets the prince, right? She's like the Meghan Markle of the Grimm brothers world, right? Like, you know, it's all good, right? It's great. Now imagine though, but the whole story pivots on the fairy godmother. I don't think the story should be called Cinderella. It should be called Fairy Godmother's Rock. Because who would not do better in life if you didn't have somebody who could turn a pumpkin into a golden carriage? Exactly. So let's retell the story without the fairy godmother. Right? So let's face it, come on. Her mother dies very young. Her father, though, he's a pretty good guy, and he does put in the basic building blocks for empathic attunement, if you want to think psychologically and all that kind of stuff. So it's not bad there, you know, a good start. But then, of course, he dies, and she's left with this evil, abusive stepmother in this kingdom. Did you notice that in that kingdom, there's no mention of education? Like what kind of like the prince has all this money to throw gala balls with gold-plated everything, but he doesn't invest any money in the education system. There's no truancy officers, right? There's no social policies. And then this kid is actually in the basement toiling away. This community, I'm going to argue this kingdom is not even a signatory to the International Labor Organization standards and conventions on child labor. What kind of awful, awful society is this? Anyways, so this poor kid is growing up in this evil empire or something like that. She's kind of, what happens? By the age of what, 14? I work a lot with street-involved youth. That's been a large part of my career. I'm going to guess somewhere around 14, 15, right? This kid says to the people around her, I am so fed up with you treating me like this, I'm out of here, right? But she doesn't end up in the palace. She gives her stepmother the finger, right? She's done with them, and she doesn't end up in the palace because there's no fairy godmother in this story. She ends up where? Behind the palace. She's cold, she's hungry. She begins to swap sex for a place to sleep at night. She's like the kids I work with. And then that turns into a bit of an addictions problem because she needs drugs. She's kind of this coping as best she can. The drug pattern then accentuates into maybe a pattern of prostitution, and then she becomes trafficked, and then the story keeps going. Cinderella the princess, or Cinderella the prostitute, and I'm not making light of this, though I have ruined the bedtime story, I admit. Cinderella the princess or the prostitute, that story hinges on the fairy godmother. And if I could, I'm going to argue that we are fairy godmothers, or fairy godfathers if you prefer. That we are that. And that the resilience of an individual is always dependent on the externals as well as what they have internal. Now, by the way, I got to tell you, back in January, I was speaking in London, England for an organization called Head Start. And their patron happens to be Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, who just had her third child, as you might follow, if you follow that at all. Anyways, and Kate was supposed to be in the audience when I was supposed to do this talk, but I only found out 2 days before I was headed over to the UK. They don't announce the princess's schedule very often in advance, too far in advance for security reasons. So I'm getting on the plane to go over, and my partner, she turns to me and says, Mike, You're not going to do the princess and prostitute story in front of the princess, are you? I chickened out. I did not do it, actually. I told a different story. But it was interesting, right? Like, you know, it's an interesting pivot on how we understand resilience. So if I could, on the top of that, you're going to have to add socio-historical dimensions. What's your economy like? People are much more resilient when there's jobs, right? If you're a kid who feels like a dunce in school, and you can get out of that and get working in the oil fields or something like that in Western Canada or down in Texas or wherever, you begin to sort of think, hey, you know, I can earn a good living. It all depends on what opportunity structures are around you. So what we do is, the group I lead, we kind of do this research all over the world, trying to understand different aspects of resilience. And I'm constantly trying to figure out what are the pivot points, what is actually the mechanisms that make it more likely that people will in fact do well. So whether I took you to, it's a little bit washed out, Tanzania or Jerusalem, or if I took you into southern Florida, where we've had colleagues work on these problems, Ireland, maybe South Africa, where I was just last week, or maybe I take you to Palestine, or we took you to China, if you prefer, or maybe I could take you to Russia. I know there's lots of connections now between the United States and Russia, I hear. And I'm a Canadian. You've got to make one political joke a day, right? And of course, I could bring you back to Halifax, right? The point is that when we're looking globally at these issues, right, there are patterns that begin to appear. What I'd like to do is, now unfortunately in this setup, I'm going to have to run behind there and play you something in a minute. I just want to set this up. I want to show you today a couple little pieces of video. The first one I want to show you, though, is from some of the research we do. Don't be scared. It's kind of nifty. What it is so we sometimes find kids in communities that are really under stress, and what we do is we film them for an entire day in their life. Like, I'm talking when they get out of bed in the morning, we have a camera on them. And we send in 2 researchers, one to take notes and one to film them. And then we work with the kids, so they film them the whole day, and then later on we meet with them and we compress all that information down to key moments in their day that talk to why they are doing well. This kid I'm about to show you, you would call this kid Native American. We don't use that term where I'm from. We call him indigenous. Maybe Aboriginal might be a better term as well, but I'm going to call him indigenous Canadian young person. You may or may not know the story of the residential school systems, but his parents were removed forcibly from their parents. They were beaten, raped, horrible situations, having the language beaten out of them, and then returned to their communities when they were adolescents and with completely, stripped of their identities and everything else. And this is a child of a family that had that kind of experience a generation before. And no surprise, in a sense, when you traumatize adults like that, this kid was raised, he was eventually apprehended by Child Welfare Services at the age of 3 and put into a foster care provider. Most of the kids that fit that profile do not do well. They suicide, they run away, they're violent, they end up in gangs, they drop out of school. The outcomes are horrible for these kids that fit that profile, even though the system has apprehended them. So that's a little bit of history there, but what caught our attention was that this kid is actually doing okay. He's going to school. He's not on drugs. He attends regularly. He seems to be involved in his community. He's still living at his foster care home provider. He's 15 years old, and we were curious, what is going on? Why is he succeeding? So what we did was we filmed him. And by the way, just so you know, the people who do this they don't look like me. Like, they're usually from the communities, and also they're younger, because if I was like walking around my community filming a 14-year-old girl with a camera, that's just kind of creepy, I'd get arrested. So we send in research assistants that are obviously younger, able to run faster than me. And what they do is, I just want to show you this in a second. So what you're about to see is just him, and what he did was that day he surprised us. He left his foster home, goes across town, right, and goes and finds his extended family. He goes and finds his cousins and his nephews and nieces to hang out with for the day on a Saturday. And when he's there, he does childcare. He actually helps. He makes a contribution to his extended family. He does all kinds of things. Isn't that great? And you think about it, he connects with his culture. He connects with a sense of purpose in life. He finds a connection to his culture, and indeed even his sense of spirituality through there. He makes all these wonderful things. He feels important. He has great self-esteem. This is all good, right? There was one small problem. The house he goes to is known to be a gang house. We had no idea that he was going to do this. So all of a sudden he takes the camera crew into a home known, I mean, what we learned later, and actually we got a phone, and we figured this out very quickly, was they sell guns out of there, they run drugs out of there, and all kinds of stuff like that. So this kid is basically migrating from a safe, secure foster home to a very dangerous environment, and he explains it as his pathway to resilience. Before you make a judgment on which is good or bad, let me just show you for just a couple minutes. I want to just show you a little bit about his actual life, so you guys can make the judgment. I got to do this. We couldn't get a line up front, so I'm going to turn that. Maybe you can just turn my volume down a little bit. There, great. Let's see if I can get this to work. So that's if you can still hear me, that's him on the couch. And let me just play this. You work a lot with kids that age, right? I mean, are a lot of boys or girls, for that matter, that comfortable? Like, it wasn't put on, right? This kid, you could see he's very comfortable doing that work. And in fact, we have other parts of the clip which I can't show you, because then he goes off and helps the drug dealers fix their computers. I guess the drug dealers in that community keep accounts on their computer, who owes them money. The computers were down, so he's actually fixing the computers as well. Now, I just find this fascinating, because from a social work point of view, we would never, I mean, is this good or bad that this kid goes to this place? Is it good or bad? All those who think it's good. Just, I mean, seriously. Good? Good? For those who think it's bad. What this kid told us was it's good. Because for these kinds of kids, there is no other source of continuity. Now, there's a set of principles underneath this is why he is surviving. I mean, I can make the judgment call that, oh my gosh, it's awful that he's going to this gang house, he's going to get involved in gangs, he's going to be groomed in or whatever. Now that might be my interpretation, but his was, this is where I connect to my kin. This is where I find my culture. This is all the things that your stupid system cannot give me, and I have found it myself. So what I'm going to suggest is that maybe what we need is a definition of resilience that's a little bit different than just us overcoming adversity. And I'm going to suggest a definition that when there's a context of significant adversity, that resilience is our ability to navigate to all the psychological, social, cultural resources, the things that we need to survive and thrive, and, if I could, our capacity to negotiate for those resources in ways that make sense for us in culturally meaningful ways. Now, I know that's a lot of words, but if you can just boil this down to two very, very simple concepts, I think you're going to get what we're seeing in the work that we do, whether it's my clinical work or my research. The first is that people need to navigate to what they need, meaning they need to show motivation to get out of bed in the morning and navigate or make their way to where they need to go. But navigation implies that you have a place to arrive to. If you don't have a place to arrive to, then what's the point of navigating? What's that wild movie? There was a movie Will Smith was in a while back called The Pursuit of Happiness. You ever see that? And Smith is this character. He eventually ends up on the Wall. He's a stockbroker on Wall Street or something at the end of the movie. But he goes through incredible hardship with his 5-year-old, and they end up sleeping in the bathrooms in the subway in New York and everything else. But he has incredible gifts. He can solve a Rubik's cube in less than 3 minutes and all this kind of other stuff. Right? And the story is a little bit told about how he perseveres, and it's really good. And I always watch that movie, and there's no social critique in that movie of, that movie was shot in 2003, 1999, whatever it was, right? Like, you couldn't have made that same story in 1960, right? It's a ridiculous fact that somehow they completely ignore the fact that context matters. That so much of why he ends up succeeding has very little to do with him. Right? It had to do, well, I'm in the home of the civil rights movement. I mean, it had to do with a lot of other structural changes that occurred. And I could use examples from my own country, or you can think obviously I'm conscious of where I am standing as well. But the point is, look, navigation is about resilience. It's not just about our motivation to find resources, it's also about what is given to us by way of our communities, or agape for that matter. And of course, but there is also a second process here, which is negotiation. What you're given has to fit with what you need. By the way, the best way I can show you this is, can I give you a small playful exercise? I do this it seems to work quite well. Sometimes people will remember things if they embody it a bit more. For 60 seconds, I just want you to play a little game with me. It has several steps in it. Just a very small little silly exercise. It's called mirrors. Some of you probably play mirrors with the kids, right? You know the mirrors? You go palm to palm. You don't have to touch, right? You don't have to touch. But in a second, I'm going to ask you to find a partner, in a second. And when you do, I want you to go palm to palm. And if one person is going to be the leader, not both. Just one of you becomes the leader. And if that person moves their hand, the other person has to move their hand. If you smile, the other person has to smile or whatever, okay? Humor me. For 10 seconds, would one of you be a leader and play the game mirrors? Just find somebody to play the game mirrors. There's a point. I promise there's a point to this, okay? Okay? Just for like 10 seconds. Okay, wait, pause. Part two. It's revenge time. The other person gets the lead.
I'll lead.
Okay, just a second. All right, I gotta bring you to part three. Part three. Now, I know you're good communicators, but this time, could you not decide who's going to start and who's going to follow? Just this time, without winks or nods, no verbal, non-verbal cues at all. Could you just go back to that very first position and start and see what happens? You got it. All right, thank you. A little awkward, yes. Now, the reason I have you do that is I think there's something to be, it's a great example. The third moment in that exercise, the third part, is a great illustration of what we do when we either research resilience or I work clinically with with a 6-year-old or anybody else in my caseload. I'm curious, most of you moved, right, the third time? You moved, right? Did anybody, how did you get moving? Somebody started? And did they just keep going and going? Like, were they the bully? I mean the leader, sorry, the leader. I said, well, I didn't mean bully, I meant leader. You took turns, it passed, right? But could you feel a tension? Imagine, the little girl who stole the candy? Imagine I'd come into that situation and she said, Mike, I want friends. But I'd said, no, I'm a developmental whatever. We focus on attachment. We're going to work on you and your mom's relationship. And the kid would have said, no, I really don't want to do that. Or she would have been obstinate, she would have been cranky, she would have been uncooperative, she would have been whatever. At the end of the therapy, even if it had worked, she still would have said, can I please have friends? And there's always an element of back and forth with our communities. I mean, you have to understand, what are people looking for? There was some interesting study of women in homeless shelters in, I think it was either New York or Toronto, I can't remember at the moment. And they asked the women, what mostly do you want? They didn't want housing. They just wanted to know the person sleeping next to them. They wanted community, first and foremost. They also wanted a locker for their the stuff that they were hauling around and everything else. They weren't looking for housing, they were looking for community. Again, and when you provide people with what they want in ways that make sense to them, their tendency is to follow us. Now let me pause there before I jump into some more specifics on this. Can I pause there? How's that sitting? I mean, we do have microphones for some questions, but I don't know if people feel comfortable asking questions, but you're certainly welcome to shout out, or we can bring you a microphone. Does anybody want to jump in on this? clarification, disagreements, high fives, all accepted. Just want to make sure I'm tuning as best I can to what you need. So far, so good? Please, ma'am. Yes, hi. Would you mind if we passed you a microphone? The room does have a bit of a noise suppression. Hi. Oh, you're going to have to turn that.
Hello?
Perfect. There you go. Hi.
Okay, I want to figure out where you're going, like with the film that we saw the young man. So he's found a setting where he is rewarded and he's found community. But what's the next step? I mean, maybe he's doing well in school now, but what's the next step?
I agree.
How do you say that this is the place for him to remain and to grow into a healthy, mature adult?
Right. Well, I guess the question is, can we, knowing that is what he's finding, the next step then would be to make sure that the same things he's finding there, we offer him elsewhere as well. So when he goes to school, is there a culturally adapted curriculum in school? Right? Is there any opportunities for him to make that same contribution that he's making to his nephews and nieces in another place in the community? Is he doing a babysitting course? Can he actually have all those kinds of responsibility? Or do we have stupid rules in our foster care system that says a child who's in foster care can't babysit another child? They can't earn money. We have all these dumb rules that we put in front of these kids, right? That take away their capacity to do the very things that they need to survive and thrive. So I would argue that the problem isn't the kid, the problem is whether or not the school system adapts, whether the foster care system adapts, and whether this kid is given opportunities in front of him to find the same things that he can use. And hopefully he finds a mentor or a counselor who actually can coach him and say, how are you keeping safe in a very dangerous place? So yeah, totally. I mean, that's not the end game. The end game is, oh great, I don't know, you ever work with other kids and say, this is great. So I've just told you, every kid you're working with that's a little bit, in foster care or having problems, you send them off to gang houses. Just have them go hang out with gang members. It's great for them. That's obviously not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is the absence of us as systems giving him anything else, he had found a solution. And that is kind of makes it easier to, it's so much easier to work with him now that the treatment team knew that. Once you know that, you don't offer him a substitute that doesn't make any sense. Like, you don't say to this kid, oh, you can go to university. Like, no. What you say to this kid is, we need to get you connected to your culture. We need to get you connected to your peers. We need to give you a place at school where you feel like you are making a contribution. Not about academics. This kid doesn't care about reading and writing. He cares about other things. And once you give him that, he'll follow you. He will follow. Thank you for that. It's a good question though. One other question just before I pivot off of that, because I want to get really specific. If you notice, I've been trying to, this woman over here, Linda, I think we have a hand over here. Hi. I hope you don't mind the microphone. It's just the room, as I say, I don't know if I could hear you otherwise.
Thank you. I want to go back to the movie when he's playing with the diamond and the lady. What's up with that?
Kind of an interesting moment that we caught on camera. The reason we wanted to show that was because it's quite outside the norm of behavior, but it is very contextually specific. I mean, he's just playing. This is the world that he lives in. He sees nothing. When we showed him the tape, because he helped us edit that tape, right? He didn't say anything weird about it. I mean, any of you work with kids that they don't see anything weird about the world that they live in? Right? They just live. They just have it. And that's why I showed you that he's just engaging with the kid. He's just playing with the kid in a way that's like normal for him. But you have to, I think for me it was very important to understand that. If that happened in my home or that happened in my, where I'm coming from, that's a really weird thing to do. But not in his world. And that's this negotiation again of trying to understand it from his side and not make the judgment. I mean, I'm saying it's weird, just to be real clear, I'm saying it's weird in my world. That's my value, that's my social location, right? But not in his. And that, I had to sort of understand it from his point of view. So thanks for that. Well, let me, if I could, what I'd like to do is probably go for about another 20 minutes before the break. Just I got you. I want to bring this as concrete as I can. I'd like to introduce sort of. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to jump. I brought more slides than I would. I'm not going to use everything I bring. What I'd like to do is talk about is 9 very concrete things that we can actually do for kids that make them more resilient. And I'm hoping that you'll have a chance to reflect on this with your work with Agape specifically to see whether or not these ideas resonate with you. So when I go around the world thinking about helping kids navigate and negotiate, that's your first principle for this morning, right? Helping kids navigate and negotiate for what they need in context of adversity. We become their fairy godmothers or fairy godfathers to make it possible. But then the question becomes, well, navigate for what? And what we see consistently are these 9 things that keep appearing. And I left you a flashcard. I'm not sure if it's somewhere, because I don't know about you, but most people throw out handouts. Nobody ever, you kind of walk out of these places. So in case, I just figured you might want to put that up on your bulletin board. That's probably the best takeaway I can give you today. And if you do want to read more, the book I Still Love You actually chronicles families going through, working together to sort of put these things into their kids' lives. I told it more as a story. Parenting. Do you hate those parenting manuals that say, just count to 3 and your child will be repaired? Perfect. It's like going, not my kids. No, not the kids I work with. No. It doesn't work like that, right? There is no magic like that. It takes a lot more to actually get things to happen. So what I want to show you is that these things work, in a sense, all together. The first one is structure. The first 2 actually go really well together, structure and consequences. It's funny, we're very good at giving kids structure. We suck at the consequences. You ever notice that? I'll give you an example. There was some food fights happening in one of the schools near to where I live. And they have those CCTV cameras, so they caught they knew the 6 kids that started the food fights, right? And so what they did was, actually my son was at that school at the time. And my son comes home and he says, oh yeah, there's been another food fight and a teacher got a can of Coke in the face and the tables were overturned and food everywhere. It's like really, really stupid kind of stuff. The teachers met, the PTA met, the kids met, anyway, whatever. I said to him, so tell me, I said to him, well, what did they do with the kids who started the food fight? And before he could say anything, I said to him, of course, well, I bet you I know what they're going to do with those kids. They're going to make those kids come in tomorrow and clean up the cafeteria. Because who have they wronged? They have wronged the janitor, the custodian of the building. And my son does that wonderful thing. You have teenagers that when they roll their eyes at you, you got any kid that does that to you, oh dad. That's not what they did. You know what they did to the kids. They suspended them. They suspended them for 5 days or something like that so they could go home and play gaming systems, or I don't know what they did, right? And I said to my son, I just blurted it out, who could be that stupid? What administrator in a school could be so thick as to suspend those kids? And he said, well, Dad, they didn't have any options. What do you mean they don't have options? They said, well, the problem was that the kids couldn't come in the next day and pick up the garbage. Why not? Well, supposedly, I don't know if it's as wacky down here as it is where I live, but supposedly once you take your sandwich and you throw it on the ground, it's a toxic substance, and you need like 3 weeks of special training to be able to sweep it up. Those kind of occupational health and safety laws and all that kind of stuff. It's a toxic substance. So these kids were not allowed to pick up their own sandwiches. Now that is us as adults. That is our craziness imposing and making our kids less resilient. So then I said, well, that's absolutely nuts. And he said there was another problem, and I want to caution because I'm a proud member of a union. He says the unions got involved and said the kids couldn't do that because they would be doing unionized labor. Who comes up with this stuff, right? Like I feel like lately it's the lawyers raising our kids. Do you ever get the sense that our lawyers are telling us what our kids can and cannot do anymore? Like we have completely lost our marbles on some of this stuff. So anyways, the kids just got suspended. And of course, it didn't stop the food fights because there's no consequences. When we build into our world, kids, opportunities for them to experience manageable amounts of risk or manageable amounts of structure, proper structure, and we hold them accountable for their actions, it seems to go really well. And I see that all over the world. Let me give you the third one, and if that's off, that doesn't matter. You have it in front of you. The next one is parent-child connections, right? I just want to pause, though, and not overemphasize those. People get real attached to this idea of attachment, that it has to be the mom or the dad that's going to repair the child. And I don't want to be disrespectful to that idea entirely, but I got to tell you, often those parents are the ones most stressed when their kid is stressed. And I find it awkward that we so put the emphasis on the one caregiver to repair a child that is particularly in crisis. And by the way, that is so ethnocentric. You go around, the other 6 billion people on the world, around the globe, would never think like that. If you were with Aboriginal communities in Australia, if I was just back from South Africa, if you were started more in communities there, you would never think that the whole responsibility for a child is with their attachment to their primary birth parent. You would diversify that to aunties, uncles, communities, teachers, coaches, people around you, which kind of brings me to the fourth point. I'm not undermining parents entirely. I'm just saying that they are a matrix of relationships. So I always like to say that and the fourth level is they need us as social workers. They need us as care providers. They need their educators, their people in their community, their spiritual communities, the youth leaders, and all those kinds of other people become really important when we're talking about resilience. The next level of this is a powerful identity. I'm always amazed that we forget that sometimes. And identity is not something let's just be real clear. You do not create your own identity. You don't wake up this morning, look in the mirror, and go, every day, in every way, I'm getting better, and I'm getting better. It doesn't work like that, right? Because if you leave your room and the first thing you hear from the first person you meet is you're nothing but a little, fill in the blank, that kind of blows the self-esteem workshop in the front of the mirror. Our identities are constructions, experiences out there in the world that affirm our talents are useful to other people. And to the extent that we're affirmed, that we sense who we are ethnically, racially, socially, economically, because of if we have a particular disability or if we're differently abled, or if depending on our sexual orientation or where we fit under the umbrella of or the rainbow of sexual identities, all those things combine to create a sense of who we are, and whether or not that's affirmed or not. So when we begin to think about this, let me go to the next one here. A sense of control or efficacy. People genuinely want to feel like their voices are heard and that they have a sense of control over their lives, their economic lives, their social lives. That's why parents sort of fight for that control over their kids, etc., etc. And of course, number 7 is that cluster of everything from spirituality to a belonging into a community, whether that's community through religion or an online community. All over the world, we saw patterns that kids wanted a sense of belonging, a life purpose. Does somebody know that you're not there today? You're not at work today? Does anybody notice that? Did anybody notice that you're not there? And if not, then that's going to be the kinds of things that we want to make sure people understand. People also have rights and they have responsibilities, and those two things cluster together as well. We need to be able to kind of give kids a sense of their rights and their responsibilities very powerfully. You saw that in the tape of the boy. He felt like he had the right to go find his culture, and he had the responsibilities to help his community. And of course, basic safety and basic support. To be free from violence, to be able to walk the streets safely, etc., etc. All these factors make us more resilient. It's very hard. Yes, I'm sure every one of you knows somebody who beat the odds and in that sort of neoliberal agenda managed to overcome great adversity even though they didn't have many of these. And that is true. But you know what? The odds against them are still stacked against them. If I have 100 people, what the science basically says is there will be 1, 2, 3 who actually do well with just their own personality. They have the capacities. But then what do we do with that story about it all being individual? The rugged individual might survive, but then it's like you're writing off the other 97. The other 97 do well, or at least the other 70 of the 97 we know will do well when we create schools and environments and communities and families that can actually give kids those things. The more your ACE score is, we suspect the higher your ACE score, the more these things actually matter to your developmental outcomes as well. So it's kind of like a Cirque du Soleil act. You know, the human acrobats and stuff. If I can juggle all 9 in the air at the same time, you begin to get a picture of what resilience actually means. Let me pause there. Questions or feedback on those things? Does that resonate with your work? Is that kind of beginning to sort of fit? Yeah? There are maybe more things you could put up on that list. But these are the ones that we actually heard from communities all around the world. Just be real clear. We did not sit around in our own little bubble, talking to a bunch of psychologists, writing from places like Harvard with a bunch of psychology students in front of them, and that those are the people that we developed theories on. That's not how we got this list. This list comes from being out in communities on 5 continents with people, and we stacked the deck against people that look like me. I was the minority in those conversations because we realized that fundamentally we needed to hear from voices from people that had other kinds of global experiences. And those are the kinds of things that they talked about. Motivation, by the way, is not on the list. Why? Because you don't need kids to have motivation. Kids don't need to be motivated. It's nice if they are, but they don't need to be motivated at all. I could give a kid all 9 of those things, and I guarantee you they'll pivot towards something better in their life, because they'll just be this big vacuum that sort of sucks them into that new direction, right? They don't need to be motivated. If I can give them all of those other things, their life will pivot into that direction. I'll give you a very small example of that. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, was looking at, we have a major problem in Canada with sedentary lifestyles and obesity amongst children. It's actually decreasing the life expectancy of our children. I don't know. I think the American stats might be somewhat the same. We have a serious problem in Canada. And so a friend of mine is looking at physical literacy and getting kids moving more. And so for 1 week, he put elementary school kids, he gave them accelerometers. How much were they moving and how fast were they moving, right, in their schools? And then they got some baseline data for a week. Then on the weekend, they went in and they painted hopscotches on the floor in the school. That's all they did. They painted hopscotches. They put the accelerometers back on the kids on Monday morning, and they took them off Friday. And guess what? The kids moved more. What kid is going to walk down the hallway in an elementary school, see a hopscotch, and not start, doing that, right? It just has to happen, right? And I mean, Richard Thaler talks about nudging people without being too paternalistic over it. I'm sort of on the same side of that, right? Whether we're talking smoking rates or whatever. Your smoking rates are going down amongst kids as well, right? So, smoking cigarettes, not pot. Smoking cigarettes is going down amongst kids. Is that generally, yeah? I think I have a bit of a theory on that. I think it has a lot to do with cell phones. Well, 2 reasons. One, it's awfully hard to. It's hard to do both at the same time, right? So that's one thing. But how many of you have kids? Some of you said you have kids, right? How many of you have a child who has a better cell phone than you have? Anybody your son has like the super Samsung 9 and you're in the old flip razor generation. You know what I'm talking about, right? You're in the flip razor and your kid has this super smartphone, right? I'm going to argue, why did people take up smoking as kids? It was a rite of passage, right? It's a status symbol. It's a way of jumping into adulthood. That's why it starts, right? I think that's a relatively common theory of it. Well, if your phone represents a jump into status, you don't need the cigarettes. Not to mention the money is about the same, right? So you begin to sort of think about substitutions, alternate pathways to get the same thing in a more socially desirable way. And suddenly you begin to tick the boxes, right? So if I have a kid and I want them to, in some ways, you want to sort of pivot them over to finding these things in better ways. Questions, comments? Please, hi, way over here. Linda, you're going to get your 10,000 steps today too. Do you mind this woman way in the corner? Just so your voice can get right over to the other side. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a couple questions, if you don't mind. The thing is, with nurture parenting. So for the parent-child connections, I guess if you could clarify, and as a parent, and I heard what you said, that maybe they don't need to be a parent. I get that, but at the same time, are you saying that because maybe the parent may be part of the problem or something? Or, because I guess I'm thinking about the nurturing parenting is it's important that they do get that attachment early, and I guess it's in the sense of on the being proactive or the preventative side versus the reactive when something is, not happening.
Let me just clarify two things. I am definitely talking about not that the parent is the problem. I'm talking about the parent is burdened. The parent is going through their own trauma. They're struggling with their own getting food on the table and the pay and the checks and everything else. And so why would we overburden them with now they have to be the repairer of the child? And I was thinking about the child a little bit older than obviously a newborn. I'm not talking about the first six. I'm not talking about the first 18 months. I'm talking about, say, after 2, where children expand their network. Sorry, I should have clarified that. I am not saying moms should or dads should put down their child. No. At that period, you need that intense experience. Absolutely. Thanks for the clarification. But second, yeah.
And I noticed that some of this is a lot of the protective factors.
Yes.
Also. And then I guess if you could clarify too about the motivations. I'm big on that. I'm big on believing that we need to encourage our children, build them up, let them be part of their powerful identity. But I guess if you didn't maybe call it that, would you be still doing the same thing if you're putting all those things in place to build them up? So what would you say about that?
So what I loved about what you just said is, and I think we'd be in exactly the same territory, because I'd be saying, I loved the way you said, we build them up. And my problem is that sometimes what we do is we miss the we build part, and we just say, kids should have motivation to change. And I go, no, I think you missed it. Kids will be motivated if you flood them in an environment with people who, if they have structure, and natural consequences and all the other things that are cueing them, and we flood them with that, and they're in zones like that, most kids, 99% of kids, will actually respond to that and pivot. But you said it, said we provide it. And I think sometimes the discourse here is kids, it comes from inside. It doesn't. It actually comes from outside. Yeah. So thank you for that. They're brilliant observations, actually. One more question here, please, and we'll pivot out here in a minute.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Not necessarily a question, but a comment in agreement to your theory or your support of family support and family engagement. I believe that's a conversation that we need to have when we talk about kids who are deemed at risk, that it really does take community and family engagement, and I'm just really proud that a lot of entities are taking that step forward to change the language of parental engagement and parental support to actually family engagement and family support.
I love it. And if I could, though, if I could add even a small bit to that conversation, what I'm saying is that when you're giving family support, if we could just make it a little more intentional and a little more purposeful in terms of the focus of that support, and I'm arguing that when we give kids these 9 things, you're more likely to have a positive outcome as, say, in a context where ACE scores are high or low or whatever. But I think sometimes, if I said the ACEs were down to 10 items, everyone focuses. And then I say protective factors, and it's like, oh yeah, everything. No. If you only have so much money and so much time with a family, look for those 9 things. The more you hit those 9 things, the more your intervention, and we're going to, by the end of today, we'll have that a little bit more solid. The more your intervention actually ticks more of those boxes on those 9 things, the more likely it is to work. And I'll give you a very small example, say working with a kid. I've sometimes encountered people have come up to me and said, I'm going to do a resilience workshop in the schools with girls. Oh yeah? And we're going to hold a self-esteem workshop for girls at lunch hour. And I go, okay, that's lovely. Okay, that's lovely, I guess. Tell me more. Get me excited. That ticks one box, identity or something. It ticks one. And then they say, no. We're actually, that group of girls is also going to be the ones that start when the Me Too stuff goes on, they're going to actually start activating on that. They're going to start being an advocate. They're going to hold a seminar. They're going to do something in the school to act. Ooh, that's kind of cool. And they're going to find new peer groups where they're kind of kick-ass girls, not the GIRL girls, but the GRRRLLL kind of girls, right? Ooh, now you're getting me interested. Now you're talking about powerful identities. Now you're talking about sense of cohesion. Now you sense a contribution back to the community of the school. Now you sense a belonging. Now you're talking about safety because the girls are saying, no, we're not safe in our washrooms and stuff here because the guys are doing this. Wow, now we're talking about safety and support. Now you're ticking all those boxes. Your self-esteem workshop for girls is going to actually elevate something and cause long-term change. But if you just run, we're going to do 8 weeks of self-esteem workbooks, forget it. You're wasting your money. I hate this. I'm sorry, you're wasting your money. There will be no long-term outcomes. The science is very clear. You will not show long-term outcomes. It will not work. But if you combine it in a matrix of other factors, it really will work. So that's it. So here's what I'm going to suggest for work. Coffee. Can we come back in 15 minutes? And I'm going to switch the conversation to Linda and a case study from here, so we can see if these ideas ground into your experience a bit. And don't hesitate to ask questions, whatever else. And we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Great.
Anything else? I'm going to get you some water, just so you'll have that up here as well.
Oh, okay.
Would that be nice?
The people who are organizing, the whole community who is organizing this, I said, well, could we get some cases that are local? And they were very kind to sort of provide some of those. So in a minute, what I'm going to ask is, who's going to do it? Shalia is going to come up and read just a verbatim a case that was local. And what I'm going to ask you then to do is to reflect on it from those 9 things, and just to see if, are they evident at all in this person's life? And if not, because the focus is really more on the problems, how might we think about getting them those 9 things? And the case we're going to work with, the first one is very much focused on children. There's 5 kids in the case. I'll let her read it out for you in a second. And you have it on your table, so you can definitely read along. Not a copy for everybody, but enough, so 1 or 2 at every table. And the idea is simply to engage you in a conversation more specifically about, okay, so do these ideas resonate with someone locally? And then I just want to have a little bit of a conversation about that. But I am going to ask you to do something, because the whole point of this also was to build, the whole point is to build connections through community through this process, if I might. And so I'm going to ask that you, because normally people come to these things and they sit with the same people that they know, right? I don't know about you, they always do that. So I'm going to guess you to sort of, when you're actually doing the discussion, to go find some strangers. Go talk to people you do not know, and do this small exercise in groups of 5. Okay? Just to sort of make those networks, make those connections, introduce yourselves, and then just start talking about those 9 things. How would they apply to this particular group of children, and how would they inform potential casework that you might go forward? Okay? So, can I have that? All right. And now the first premiere performance of... Do you mind grabbing a microphone there?
So what I'm going to do is just read the case study if you're reading along with it. Anybody not have the case study?
Not everyone has a copy in front of them.
Actually,
So,
I think they might.
oh, you did? Okay.
Bailey read and got more copies.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so you have it then. Great.
We're good to go?
Good to go.
I think we're good to go.
All right. Case study number 3. Raymond, Darius, Dalia, Calvin, and Caleb are 5 African-American siblings who have experienced severe traumatic stress. Raymond is a 10-year-old male in 4th grade. Darius is a 9-year-old male in 3rd grade. Dalia is a 9-year-old female in 4th grade. Calvin is an 8-year-old male in 2nd grade. And Caleb is an 8-year-old male in 3rd grade. The siblings have been in the Achievement School District for 1 year, for 1.5 complete school years. They previously attended the Shelby County School, where they were involved in altercations with peers and with each other on a continual basis. Their mother is recently deceased, and the father is unable to give them the support that they need. After their mother died in early December 2017, the children's father put the children in the care of the maternal aunt, who was recently awarded custody of the children. The family was referred to Agape for wraparound services due to the children's behavior and school attendance problems. Although their aunt provides the children with a high level of care, her resources are limited. The children display very aggressive behavior at both school and home. They fight each other as well as their peers while at school, and have received multiple school suspensions for fighting, vulgar language, and violation of school rules. At home, they are very competitive and aggressive in their interactions with each other, and constantly seek their own attention. All of the children perform at grade level on tests, but their grades are negatively affected by the frequent school absences, often due to school suspensions. Darius previously failed the 3rd grade, and Calvin previously failed the 2nd grade. Working with the Agape Connector has resulted in some limited success in reducing the problem behaviors at school, but the children continue to be at high risk for school suspension as a result of their aggressive behavior. The siblings have not received any therapy to address issues of grief and loss related to the death of their mother and the subsequent loss of connection with the father, who rarely visits them now and they live with their maternal aunt. Their aunt is willing to participate in family counseling, but is unsure, but is unsure whether the children's father would do so. The children have very little contact with their father's family, although his parents and 2 of the siblings live in the Memphis area. The children and their parents moved often over the past few years and have moved into their own home, and custody is the first time in several years that they have had any sort of stability. They have not been involved with any church or community groups and seem to have no significant friendships and very little peer support. Their aunt says that she does not know many of their neighbors, but indicated that there are other school-age children who live in the neighborhood. She attended church before the children came to live with her, but is worried that the children's behavior will be a problem if they were to attend church as a family. She went on to say that she has had little time for her friends since the children came to live with her, and now has almost no social life outside the home.
Thank you very much. So if you could I'm going to ask you for about 15 minutes just to go find some people you do not know and to think about those 9 things. How might that map embellish possibilities or increase the opportunities? Or how would you help these children find some of those 9 things in the context of Shelby County? Okay? So I'm going to pass you along. Go find some strangers, talk to some neighbors, and spend 15 minutes thinking about what you do using those 9 things I just talked about. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a map that narrows down the options a little bit, it just makes it easier. And the evidence is on your side, so if you can focus in on these 9 things, and the more of these you hit, you tend to produce faster outcomes. So, good programs that I've seen around the world that actually do that would very much decode all the information here in terms of quickly giving the kids what they wanted. One group said, of course, it begs, the most obvious one is get grandma to go back to church, right? That's an obvious one, right? But the issue was, I was saying that, so how would you get the kids to the church? It's not just about grandma going to the church, it's about getting the kids to the church. And what is the mechanism in her church to allow the 5 children to be there? Because she's worried that they're going to act out and embarrass her. So that means it's not her problem, and it sure as heck isn't the children's problem. It is the problem of the church. It's the church's problem. So how does the church accommodate those 5 kids to be there so Granny can get her, re-energized, and those kids can get well taken care of? Do you want to jump in?
So I go to a church where they assign a shadow to children who have problems.
Right.
And so we open communication with the church, asking for help, and then you're also putting a community member in that child's life that's going to pour out on them, notice that they're there, and love on them.
Exactly. And that's the neat thing, is you begin to tick more of the boxes. Now you have number 4, which was more and more relationships building, especially if that was, I'm going to guess, an older male for some of these young little boys who are kind of rambunctious and going all over the place. Though the gender might not be the important deciding factor, right? I was also curious, how would this grandmother get 5 little kids to church? What do? You can't exactly, if she has a car, hopefully, but that's 6 people, how many people have 6 seatbelts? Is that, there's other logistical problems here as well, right? Would people come and get the kids? Or, do you see where my mind goes? You can say, well, you should get to church, and you go, hang on a minute, we got a transportation problem, right? We have 6, you don't need just 1 shadow, you're going to need 5 shadows. Or, but I could see a bunch of 14-year-old, 15-year-old boys and girls possibly being kind of up for that. I get to sort of be the supervisor of some younger kids. That could kind of be cool for them, right? You sort of see where the pieces are going? And then, of course, I would even go further with it. Not in the week 1, but if I could get them stabilized at the church with the shadows, I wouldn't just have the shadows play with them or do, the teachings and stuff. I would then begin to think, hang on a minute, we got some food to serve later on. You got to get those kids not just, if I want my kids to have a powerful identity, they've got to be useful, and they got to know it counts. So you can't have them just being children. You got to say to them, okay, you got responsibilities in this church as well, because we're putting out for you. Now you're going to come on Sundays, and you're going to help us, whether it's make the cookies at home. That would even be better if they actually worked with Granny to buy if you could somehow figure that out, and they actually bake some cookies that they brought, or, I'm taking this some sort of service, or some sort of sharing afterward, as many churches, at least where that's common. I would actually have the kids be the ones who have to set the table. They're the ones putting it on the table. Maybe sneaking a cookie or two. I'm okay with that. Okay? But that becomes the whole sort of pattern. And that's how I'm thinking. Now, at least that's not going to solve everything. But if they have for 3 hours a week structure, consequences, responsibility, sense of community, belonging, and everything else. If I could spend all my resources, and 3 months from now, those 5 little boys had 1 weekend, 1 Sunday morning like that, that would be amazing, right? That would be a case plan. That would be ideal for me. That would be like a goal. But again, if you notice, I'm ticking more of the boxes. That's how I'm thinking. Because it's not random. I'm not just going, kids go church, in building, we're all done. No. We're not even starting. That's just the beginning. Thanks for that. That's very helpful. Anyone else want to do another part of this? The school part, maybe? What are you going to do about the school? Hi, sir. Yeah, do you mind either big voice or microphone, whichever you prefer? Both.
I just wanted to talk into a mic. A couple things that when we went into this, it's easy to, in our roles in social work and ministry, to prescribe easily and to just take the 9 different things and just say, oh God, I just need these. And then everything sticks.
Yeah.
So one thing that we kind of took on our table was to try to see what was actually in the summary and make some notes, mental notes about, okay, well maybe there's some information that is missing, so I don't want to just lay on this prescription because something may or may not be going on in the school. But a couple things that we did note, particularly to the school, was one thing is with the behavior, we noticed that God the Connector has limited success in reducing problem behaviors at school, which is really great. But one thing we didn't see was what was happening on the school then. So it would be obvious to kind of put in a 504 plan or to have an IEP, something that would really outline the consequences that would be that the school could agree to, that would be outside the system, outside of the suspensions, because it seems like the connector's doing a lot of hard legwork individually, probably with teachers, probably with the student, like playing the negotiator all the time. It'd be nice for something to be on paper.
Well said.
Say, we are, as a school, are saying that we will not suspend a student. We will make them pick up sandwiches on the floor, or whatever.
Yes,
and,
that would be nice. Sure. One more?
Just something on paper there. Another thing that, just two things to mention here. We did talk about grief counseling.
Yes.
And how important that would be. And we said particular to numbers 5 and 6, powerful identity and a sense of control, because
they don't.
Mom was a part of identity for that entire family, and there probably is no control, and grief counselor might help identify this is where you don't have control, and this is where you do have control, and that could be helpful for months of pre-adolescence.
That's great.
And the last thing I want to mention on here was number 3 with the parent-child connections, getting dad visible somehow, because dad's got to deal with it, and we don't want to put a load on dad, but like a sticker, a note, something for kids to see, like, I am here.
Yeah.
I'm not completely absent, where it may be too much work for a lot of people just to get dad to have this magical sitcom appearance.
No.
It might be meaningful to just get some sort of visibility or presence there.
Thanks ever so much. That's, very good. If I could just kind of build on those things, that's neat that you're beginning now to think about the home, the school, the dad. When you do more of those stuff, I mean, I know it takes resources. I'm not naive to that. But some of these are, you can work out one at a time. You can also kind of go for a small win. Like coming back to the idea of navigation negotiation, I'm not sure I would ever, I would bet, maybe your dad is different than my dad's. This dad is not going to show up for grief counseling. He's not going to show up for therapy. I don't know. Maybe he would. I'm going to guess not. But he might show up if he was invited to take the kids, especially with some supports, to do something that he feels is already part of his space. I don't know. Maybe he goes and watches. Is there something that this guy might be doing on the weekends already that the kids could join in, like something in the outdoors, something to do with, if you've got a racetrack. I'm just thinking of some of the guys I've recently worked with, where they might take the kids, or not all 5, that would be too much, but they might take 1 or 2 along with them. Fitting the kid into their world is a little bit easier than asking them to fit into the kids' world, because dad might not feel comfortable doing that. So I begin to sort of again think about, because the kids, especially something that's more socially desirable, a behavior on dad's part that it's actually pro-social. Maybe the kids find that. Worked with recently a guy who was really into stock car racing and that type of thing. So he was taking the kids down to the stock car races on the weekend. We didn't push him into grief counseling. He was not even close to that. But he was cool on taking a couple of his sons with him down to the racetrack, right? And then it was cars, and they had they have something to talk about. This guy had no idea what to say to us. Hi. That was the end of the conversation, right? It's like, and maybe, So it was like giving them a place to be and a way to, and a way to sort of have those conversations. It's just so much easier. It's like having the sex talk with your teenagers. Any of you have to do that yet? Right? Isn't that a fun talk? They say it's easier in a car. Drive somewhere. They are captured. They can't jump out. And you're both looking forward, right? That's great. Okay, let's just talk about that, those feelings. No, I'm not slowing down. My daughter, I think, was never mind. It was embarrassing. Anyways, from the word go. So you get the idea where I'm going with this, right? It's a map. It's one of the maps. Helping people navigate, negotiate for those 9 things as best we can in their context. So far, so good. Any other quick comments before we move on to? I want to add some more pieces to this. I don't want to just stop saying that's the end of it. There's more complexity here. Cool. Please. Hi. Can we get you a microphone just so you can be heard?
I'm trying to refer to my colleague, but we looked at from making the kids feel safe, and I let her talk about how we did it.
It won't work on if you don't mind. You just got voluntold. No, I think if you don't mind, the room really does have a dampening on the sound. It really won't. It really is easier with the voice loud. Please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. We talk about safety and support systems for a child, for children, and making sure that the aunt includes community support, the grandmother as an extended resource to make a child feel safe because of all the experiences that they had. Add the grandmother or an extended family member in the mix because there's a nurturing aspect of it. So that's the only thing I wanted to interject. And
Sure.
I wanted to thank my team member for giving me
And sorry, I was saying grandmother. I meant aunt. Aunt was the primary caregiver. My apologies. I got jumbled a little bit in my thinking as well. Great. So anyways, you see the patterns I'm sort of getting at here. Is it possible to get that video on at all? Does it work at all? Up here? Will it come up at all? Or are we completely down? No? It may not, doesn't work? Just give us a pause here for 10 seconds. No? Linda, oops.
After lunch, we're going to have to get a projector and do the video.
Okay, that's cool. So yeah, no. Let me just tell you. Just give me literally 10 seconds then. So let me give you some other examples of this. It works a little bit better with the visual. I can certainly do it without. When I begin to think about these things, you begin to think about all kinds of threads off of this. So then you begin to think about, you think about religious communities, you think about social service networks, hospital care, transportation systems. Now I realize you can't change all those things, but you can begin to at least think about the problems and begin to sort of, without blaming people for not showing up, you suddenly realize the complexity of their lives. It also, by the way, makes you sensitive to where the real strengths are. I don't know about you, but sometimes we are so quick to assume that certain things are good and certain things are bad. One of the things, I'll give you a small example. We in Canada right now, we're ripping down some of our public housing. Do you have public housing in Memphis? Some of it? And a lot of it looked like, I don't know what yours looked like, I have not seen your public housing, but a lot of our public housing was these sort of low-rise, 5-story cement block sort of structures, right? A lot of people housed, it was supposed to be very efficient. And in the 1960s, it was meant well. Most of those places have deteriorated, and in fact, what they're now understanding from a sociological point of view is that if you put people into those kinds of buildings, you make people sick. The building is the problem, not the people. If you put any person into those kinds of buildings that break down any capacity at all for a sense of community, buildings that don't give you sight lines down to the street or balconies where you can see and monitor your children. If you are putting people into those kinds of places, you create illness. What is actually much better for people, which people forget, is those kind of more dense streetscapes. You know those places where you kind of walk down the street and you have storefronts at the bottom and like people living up above that we sometimes see as urban poverty? What they've actually shown is a lot of times those are healthier communities to live in. Why? Because you hang out your window, you see your kid down there, or if you don't see your kid, then your neighbor or your cousin or your third cousin looks out the neighbor and says, "Hey, what are you doing? George, Julio, whoever you are, I know your mother. What are you doing down there?" Right? And we forget that sometimes in our efforts to sort of make people well, we've actually sometimes harmed them in terms of how we design homes. Now, by the way, I'm going to go one step further. I don't know if Memphis, I haven't really seen enough of your community, but if you live in the suburbs, you're at all kinds of other risks, right? We sometimes forget about that, right? We sort of think, oh, urban environments is dangerous and always and risky. And I realize there is a lot, where the gun violence is, I get some of that. But we forget that there's other risk factors involved in living in the suburbs. People don't want to, no, suburbs are good. No, actually, suburbs kill you, eh? You do know that, right? Suburbs kill you. Absolutely. And I'm not talking about necessarily some of the dangers you might be thinking about in urban environments. It's because you're on the road more, right? Statistically, you're probably much more likely to die in a car accident by living in the suburbs. Statistically, you're also more likely to have problems with sedentary lifestyles, heart disease and everything else if you live in the suburbs, because you're not moving as much, right? You're spending all your time commuting. Not to mention, if you live in a little bit larger house and stuff like that, you got all kinds of other problems as well, right? So we can get real smug about, oh, well, those problems are for those people and these problems aren't to us. But actually, whoever you are, certain environments provoke other kinds of problems, right? You don't see your kids as much if you live in a larger house. If you're on the road all the time commuting, you're more likely to have divorces in your life and all the kind of other stuff. Your relationships are going to break down. And we go, oh my gosh, that's right. And I always say to people, oh my gosh, don't live in those suburbs. Move back into the city. You'll be so much safer. You'll live longer. You'll be healthier and everything else. I mean, well, that's kind of weird. But actually, there's a little bit of statistical truth in that. Just like, the other statistical truth that we always say, oh my gosh, you ever work with parents that are really, really protective? Now that makes sense if you're in a dangerous environment. I guess most of you would not be working with communities where it actually is fairly safe. That's probably not on the thing. Just to say, sometimes people forget that actually, the place that where is the most dangerous place for a child, by far? Where is the most dangerous place for a child to be? Where are they most likely to die from any kind of violence? Gun violence or otherwise. Where are they most likely to be sexually abused? Where are they most likely to be preyed on by online predators? Where are they most likely to be abused? Where are they most likely to be bullied? Where are they most, all those indicators, they happen in homes. In fact, I always joke with my audience and say, if you really want children to be safe, we'd push them out the front door and get them out and back onto the streets. That's a statistical thing. Now, that's not entirely true if the community you're pushing them out into is really dangerous as well. But we do forget that there's nuanced parts of this story. The other one was, have you ever done any workshops on this idea of the right kind of parenting? Do you know that kind of parenting that was popularized back in the 70s of a woman named, what's her name? Diana Beaumorin. Talked about 3 kinds of parenting. Have you ever heard that? There was the sort of the very brick wall kind of parenting, very authoritarian sort of parenting that says my way or the highway. And then there was another kind of parenting that was extremely permissive. It's like, well, kind of whatever you really want. It is kind of a school night, but if you really want to go out, that's okay. That kind of. And then there's always this kind of third kind of parenting that's held up as the epitome of perfect, right? Which is authoritative. Barbara Coloroso, who's done a lot of this kind of stuff, she talked about. She described it as having a backbone, structure, but flexible, right? And I thought that's kind of cool. Except, did you know that the stats on that, the science on that, actually doesn't support the model? Where they always uphold the backbone family is the one that's you're supposed to negotiate with your kids, right? You're supposed to be, not too authoritarian and not too permissive. But what they forgot to tell you was it matters in the environment. In fact, what they showed was that in this case it was African American families living in higher risk communities. Actually, this backbone family, their kids had poorer outcomes because there really was danger beyond the street. And what they showed was it was the parents, principally the mothers, who told their kids, no, we don't negotiate. I'm sorry, this is not a democracy. You do exactly what I say. If I say you get your ass home after school, you get home after school. You do exactly, and this is kind of the way, if you looked at the qualitative data on this is actually what they were saying. The parent really asserted that this is exactly what the child was supposed to do, what the expectations were, and they obeyed. And those parents had better child outcomes. But if that same parenting style was pushed off into, the white suburbs with, sort of a certain demographic, economic, whatever, or in fact, it's actually not white. In this case, it's actually socioeconomic class. if you really want to be more specific in the studies. If you push it into a different socioeconomic status, which conflates with class, and we can get into all that stuff in a moment, but whatever. But basically, that parenting style, then it's the backbone family. Because the community outside is in fact safe, or perceived at least as safer. So what I'm trying to say is there's a dynamic here, this dance, this negotiation between our environment, whether it's our housing models or our parenting styles, they are going to change depending on the environment. So let me see if I can help you to make this even more concrete. I brought you an exercise. We've been developing as a group a way of talking about a measure of resilience. Now, I'm assuming not many of you are actually doing assessments of kids or doing pre-test, post-test on your programs and all that kind of stuff. I use this measure mostly as a guide for questions that I can ask kids. I've given you the 9 things. I've talked about navigation negotiation, but now I'd like to give you another tool that if you do want to sort of really broaden the kinds of things you can think about. So, in your packet, there is a measure of resilience. It looks like this, and if you flip, there's 2 versions of it. One is for adolescents. Well, again, I'll explain this in a second. And one is for younger kids. The one for younger kids is with the happy faces. The younger version is good for about, say, some 7 or 8 years old up to about 11. And then the other version, the 28-item version, is for kids about age 12-ish up to early 20s. Now, here's the trick. We assume 0 literacy, and we allow people to, when they use this, we encourage people to code switch. So if you're reading a question and they don't, the kid's not getting it, that's fine. Just reword the question to get the gist of what the question's about, right? And of course, we never assume the kid we assume 0 literacy when we administer this in all our work, so we always have an adult read it out to the child. So, you can switch the words a little bit, you can imagine it being read out. But here's the exercise if I could. Could I ask you to think about a child, anywhere from age 7 to early 20s, that you're struggling with, seriously struggling to work with, right? And how would they answer these questions, depending on which version of the questionnaire that you ask? So here's the exercise. I'd like you to just fill in the questionnaire from the perspective of the child, and then what I'd like you to do after you've filled in the questionnaire from the perspective of the child, just turn to your colleague and just chat about it for a few minutes, and we'll come back in about 5 minutes, okay? Just going to go through it just to sort of see what you got, okay? From the perspective of the child, answer the questions. Okay? 2 different versions of it. I'll catch you up in about 5 or 6 minutes. conversation ever so slightly? If I could? Somebody? No? Any of them jump out at you? Sorry?
Number 20.
You have to 20 on the adolescent version. Number 20 is, I have opportunities to show others that I'm becoming an adult and can act responsibly. That one? Yeah. It's a really important one because when we worked with kids all around the world who were resilient, they said that often they had those opportunities to show others that they were getting older. Do we build that in? Instead, what we often do is we treat kids like babies. So they come into our services and we ask them to be clients. But that's not a good thing that's a good thing to keep them safe. It's a lousy strategy if you want to build resilience. If you want to build resilience, you have to give them responsibilities. Did you notice the moment you were telling me about Darius and the 5 kids, I said, don't just have them come to church. That's okay. It's not great. It's okay. It's a nice idea. Have them come to church and contribute. Now you're getting the idea. Then you're talking about resilience, right? That's what makes the difference, right? And the kid then becomes motivated because if they know that somebody is counting on them to do something at the church on Sunday morning, then when the mom or the aunt says, look, we got to go to church, it's not the aunt saying, I'm pulling you to church. It's the church community saying, we need you. And then if the kid doesn't show up, then somebody follows up with that kid and says, hey, you know, the cookies didn't get served. Like, that was awful. You know, we missed you. You know, like this didn't work as well, right? And that's really different, right? And all of a sudden the kid's walking around like little Ginny going, oh yeah, strut. You know, I've got something important to contribute here. I'm not, you know, I've seen this enough. We've recreated this enough in terms of clinical patterns. It's remarkable how those little things do engage. Any others? You cool? Yeah? So, great. So I guess I wanted to leave you with that, mostly because, I mean, there's a lot of use in that. If I could, I'm not sure, again, we'll see if this is actually going to work or not. Probably, it's kind of a little vague, but you do have this. I'm going to jump over some of the differential impact stuff because I'm just going to use the slides that I think are the most relevant to you. If you can find the slide that looks like a bunch of snakes coming off of the map there. What I wanted to do is I just wanted to walk you through some of the different patterns that resilience shows up as, partly to help you to see it, because sometimes we miss it. We think that the only kid that's doing well is the one that, say, goes to church, or the only kid that does well is the one who does well at school. And I want to throw that to the side and encourage you to see the kids from the perspective of who they are and how they navigate and negotiate in the context in which they actually live. So let me see if I can walk you through these different pathways. You see them in your slides. I won't really be able to show you this, but maybe I'll just walk you through it a little bit. So look, the very first way that we often talk about resilience is people recover, right? They come through adversity, they hit acute stressors and chronic stressors. That's the way we talk about, the idea that you hit an acute stressor, that maybe that's one incident of something bad happens, you're in an accident. It could even be you being sexually victimized or beaten or bullied once or something like that. Okay, and you come back to your normal functioning. You flail around a little bit, you get back, right? You also have chronic stressors, racism, social marginalization, poverty, violence, and those kinds of things which are more chronic and they compound the effect. So we know that people who have both those things happen tend to sort of hit a double whammy and the recovery is often slower. And the idea is that people get back to being, whatever your normal is, that's what you're doing. Okay, that's one map of resilience. It's not the only map though. There's another one which sometimes we just see a non-impact. People just show resilience because they don't show the trauma that we expect them to. They've been abused, but they don't show trauma. And often they don't show trauma because of the third pathway, which is something called minimal impact resilience. Most of us, because we have many of those 9 things in our life, according to George Bonanno and others, like in New York, basically if you have those things, guess what? You do okay, right? And I am talking like really harsh things like studies of sexual abuse, studies of physical abuse. If you put in place most of those 9 things, people tend to be able to recover without a grief counselor, without a psychological intervention. In fact, if I was honestly doing this, I would say, if say we have 100 people in the room, I use a simple rule of 70, 20, 10. If I provided people in this room with as many of those 9 things as possible, 70%, so if I'm starting from that side, you folks would generally respond to my intervention, right to about here, right? And you guys you'd go to school, you'd get your lives together, you'd find your way, you'd get a job, you'd grow up, you have your relationships. Generally speaking, you're okay, you know? Now that leaves about 30% of the room. You folks, generally speaking, are going to need some, what we say is a tertiary level treatment. You're going to need a psychologist, a social worker, an extra care worker. You're going to need some service from the healthcare system or the psychological services or you're going to need extra help. It's not enough. Now here's the interesting truth. I don't care what I give you, family therapy, psychotherapy, a drug, the general response rate is 60 to 70%. I know people are going to say, no, it's 100%. It isn't. Generally speaking, almost all interventions have some sort of range. Sometimes it's 30, sometimes it's 80, but generally speaking, let's just split it down the middle and say about 66% of people respond to treatment when it's given. So that means out of 30% of my audience, right? 20% more of you will respond if I can get you to the hospital, if I can get you to the therapist, if I can give you an extra caseworker, if I can give you a big brother, big sister, if I can basically give you an extra service, you will respond. Now, unfortunately, that leaves you 10%. Now, I don't know, but you guys are kind of like, you're on drugs. You guys sleep around. You guys have some serious social problems. I don't even know you, and I'm just looking at you. You guys look like you have those problems. Like, you know, I don't know why they sat over there either, but they did. And those groups, over this last row, this last 10%, you guys got issues. And even though we've given you lots of resources and we've given you some extra treatment, you have not responded. And you folks actually need time, structure, and consequences. Just basic stuff that society gives you. And there's some wonderful studies of people, like there was a study of 500 delinquent boys that started in the 1930s by folks that was picked up by this couple named the Glukes back in the 1930s, and they looked at 500 delinquent boys. And then another group, John Lobb and Robert Sampson, picked up the sample from Harvard when these guys were about 69 years old, right? They found these same 500 boys. And they said, well, how did you turn out in life? You were all delinquents. You were all in like a home for delinquent boys, right? 500 of you. And what they actually found was that most of you did okay in life. Not early, but it took you a little while. And do you know why do you think they eventually turned out okay? Most of them turned out just fine once they hit about 60, 50, 40, 30, those kinds of ages. They had things that happened in their environment. Two that really stood out for me. One, military service. For some, that had a certain but if you think about it, I'm not for conscription or anything, but if you think about it in that particular context, for the young men, these are all men who went into some military service, they seemed to get an identity, stability, structure, something routine, a job, a trade, or something like that set them off the path of being more the delinquent adult. That was interesting. And you know what the second one was? They married well. Now, to be fair, they never interviewed the women who married these little delinquent men. They never talked to the women to say, what was it like raising a delinquent guy into his adulthood? That would be an interesting study. But what they know is that the men who quote, and they use by the way, there's a heterosexual bias in my languaging here, of course, I am saying married well, but very much, they married well, and therefore that really pivoted. And if you think about what happened when they married well, they basically had expectations, they had responsibilities at home, they couldn't be out drinking all night, they had other things, it stabilized their life and pivoted them towards other, better life trajectories. Again, it's partly their motivation, but it was really it was a sort of a serve and return kind of function with the environment. So that's what gets really interesting, right? So suddenly we have this model of, okay, so people do recover, they do okay. Now, there's another pattern. Have you ever heard of post-traumatic growth? I gotta hand it to Oprah. She made her career on post-traumatic growth. She interviewed people who came through adversity, found something about themselves, and did much better than they possibly could, right? And that idea. In fact, if I have 100 people in the room, some of you have to show post-traumatic growth, right? That you came out of adversity, you figured out your life, and you made something more of your life than you would have without the adversity. The best example I've ever heard of is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Do you have MAD chapters down in here? So if MAD is a good example, I mean, you would never wish that a mother loses her child to a drunk driver. But I can also bet you that those women would not have formed MAD without that tragedy in their lives. So there's a bit of a mechanism there of post-traumatic growth that actually brings out the best in us after adversity. Those are nice patterns, right? Recovery, minimal impact, post-traumatic growth. I don't work with people who show those patterns of resilience. I work with people who show these other patterns, avoidant strategies. Did you know that children who shut down emotionally survive child abuse better than children who keep looking for attachments? Let me replay it. If you're in a situation and your father or mother is constantly going to, you're never sure of if the attachment is secure, your emotional withdrawal is a protective mechanism as long as the abuse continues. And then we come in and say, no, you should be attached. No. The protective mechanism is to shut down. And by the way, the same pattern appears for others. There's a really interesting study that showed that American soldiers who were deployed into Afghanistan and Iraq, the men and women who had experiences of child abuse, this is where the sophistication of all the studies kind of gets interesting. Soldiers who were deployed to those two theaters of war who had histories of child abuse, but had used an avoidant emotional withdrawal strategy, showed fewer signs of PTSD as a consequence of their exposure to war. Which kind of makes sense. If you're in a theater of war where you're never sure who your enemy is it the person fighting next to you, so the local forces? Is the person you're training to be a fight? You never know what is exactly going to happen. And you're used to that ambiguity because of the violence you experienced growing up. You are actually ready for that situation much better. Now the problem with that strategy is when they came home, those same men and women, when they came home and then came off deployment and had to go back into their relationships, they sucked at it. Because they did not know how to engage in a loving relationship because they had this emotionally avoidant strategy. My point is, emotional avoidant strategies work in some contexts. And that changes how we see people, right? So if you have a kid using a strategy, change the context first before you change the kid, or else it will not work. By the way, that also works with acculturation. You know that about immigrants? The worst thing you can have is a first-generation immigrant acculturate, fit into the community. It actually totals their mental health. People who do not acculturate score higher on mental health scores. You know this, right? You know this? It's very interesting, right? So here we are trying to tell people, oh, well, welcome to our community, fit in. No, don't. Not the first generation. Then what you want, get on the Facebook and communicate back with your heritage culture wherever you're from. That's actually better for your mental health. You're going to have less sleepless nights, less self-esteem problems, less this and that. Don't acculturate. Now, second generation, third generation, that's different. They got to acculturate. But they've got to find that third cultural space, that balance between the heritage culture and the new culture that they've come to. But the first culture, mental health threat if they do. Again, that's the science here. By the way, then there's another pattern, which is hidden resilience. So sometimes people just show hidden resilience. For instance, a kid will parentify. You must work with some 10-year-olds that are looking after younger siblings. Do you work with 10-year-olds who are cooking meals for mom because mom has a serious addiction problem or dad has a serious disability, an injury of some sort? Do you work with kids like that? We always think, oh, that's bad. Oh my gosh, no, the child should not be having any responsibilities for the parent, that's bad. But actually, you know what? The science on this is against you. It's good. Parentified children are not traumatized as long as they really do know that the parent they're helping needs them, and there's a reinforcement from the rest of the community and their extended family that says, oh my God, you're helping your mother through a really tough time. What a wonderful child you are, right? If you get that, the parentification process is not dangerous. It's this, but I can tell you, if I went home, I'm able-bodied, I should be able to look after my children. I don't seem to have my children look at me. They don't see any particular reason. I don't have an addiction problem. I don't have any deep trauma. If I go home tonight, though, my partner and I, we just, sit down and go to our 15-year-old. You know what? I hear parentification's kind of good. We're just going to kick back here. You're going to cook dinner. You're going to clean the house. We're just not going to do any more of that stuff. My 15-year-old would probably respond like, this is kind of wacky and weird. I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about this. Because, of course, there's no excuse for me backing out of the parenting role. Context in each of these cases matter. And, of course, if I could, the last one, the very bottom, which you see, is maladaptive coping. Gangs are good, right? Can we all agree on that? Go, gangs, go. No? Of course they're good. There's lots of studies that show gangs are great. Mexican Americans in like San Diego stuff, they join gangs because that's safer than not being part of a gang. You don't want to be the individual walking around your streets. Gangs in Winnipeg, up around where I live, indigenous kids join gangs because they feel a better pride. They sense, better, it's an access. You get money. You can have a variety of resources that you might not have otherwise. Now, you're saying, hey, Mike, are you promoting gangs? No, of course not. What I'm saying is, in resource-poor environments, kids will navigate to whatever they can find to survive and thrive. If we don't put a substitute in that's viable, we cannot blame the kids for making bad choices. It's us that have failed them, not the other way around. So when we pivot the environments, we are likely to see kids choosing more socially desirable options. I'll give you, just in the spirit of closing that down here. So I'm always thinking about that. There's a teacher in a small town in rural Canada. And he, as part of his grade 9 class, he includes some of the more vulnerable kids to build go-karts as the assignment in grade 9. He has the ability, he has a little shop there, a little metal shop in the school, right? And this is kind of cool. Now that's kind of nice. That's like ticking one of the boxes. This guy has the grade 9 students, and usually the boys, especially the boys, some of the girls who are more vulnerable learners, build the go-karts. They use whippersnipper, those little lawn things that, little trimmers, motors. So they go like, 0. They don't go very fast or anything. But those kids are often more engaged in building a car than they are the academics. But they learn geometry and they learn some math and everything else. And they build their go-karts. Now that's neat, right? So they have a little self-esteem book. And then what he does is on a Saturday at the end of the school year, he has a derby. So all the kids in their teams have to race their cars. And all the community comes out to watch the kids race their cars. And all the other geekier kids, they do things like put on bake sales and everything else to raise money for the school. But who do you think is the star of the show? Not the geeky kids, not the academically inclined kids. It's the kids who are